One thing I always grow a lot of in the garden is beans, and now that it's September, the beans are really coming into their own. These are runner beans beside me, and anyone who grows runner beans will know that really you don't need that many and you get tons and tons of beans that will do you for weeks on end. In fact, you'll almost get sick of them. But there's loads of things you can do to keep them, like just freezing them. It's quite a good way to keep them for the colder months. In this nice pyramid of beans that I've got, mixed in I've got a nasturtium. Now this is actually one nasturtium plant which I planted right in the middle of the teepee when I was putting the beans in. And the idea of the nasturtium is that it keeps the weeds down, but it also attracts in pollinating insects like bees. And you want as many bees as possible near your beans because they've got flowers, and you won't get beans if you don't get the flowers pollinated. This one single nasturtium plant has gone a bit crazy and it's just gone absolutely everywhere. I've kind of left it because I really like it and I think it looks very pretty, and it doesn't really do any harm. If it starts to encroach into any areas where it's doing damage to some of the other plants, then I will snip it back a little bit. One of the things that I planted in the video in April was some broad beans, and this is actually the broad beans that were planted at that time. It's a variety called the Sutton Dwarf, so it's quite a short variety broad bean, which is great if you've got a windy garden, because one of the problems with broad beans is that they do tend to fall over. Now with the Sutton Dwarf, you should be able to get away with not staking them, i.e. sort of tying them to a cane. And I'm a bit lazy, so I'd really like to not do that unless I really absolutely have to. Unfortunately, my ones have all kind of fallen over and intermingled a bit, and it's just a sign that I'm a little bit of a lazy gardener. It doesn't really do them any harm unless they all start lying on the ground, which can help them to rot and things like that. So it's better to stake them up if you can be bothered doing it. Another bean I've planted beside my broad beans is something called a field bean. Now, field beans are a little bit smaller than broad beans, but they do tend to stay quite tender, whereas broad beans, if you leave them until they get big, they get quite tough and you have to double peel them. The variety that I've planted is something called Wizard, and you should be able to find seeds for it if you search on the internet. One problem that I do have with all my broad beans actually, and my field beans as well, is a disease called chocolate spot. It's actually a mould that forms on the leaves, and it can also spread to the bean pods as well. Generally it's not a huge amount of a problem, but once it spreads to the pods it can make the beans inedible. There is not much of a cure for chocolate spot, unfortunately, certainly not if you're an organic gardener. You just need to try and space your bean plants as far apart as possible and make sure the soil isn't acid. Another bean that I like to grow is the good old-fashioned French bean. Part of the problem with French beans, and with runner beans as well actually, is that they tend to hide away amongst the foliage. So a good way to get around this is to grow one that's a different colour, which makes them much easier to find against the leaves. This year I've grown a yellow one. It's called Minador, and it actually keeps its yellow colour after it's cooked. A lot of them will revert back to a green state after they've been boiled. But the Minadors stay yellow, which means they're really pretty on the plate, they're easy to find, and they're really tasty too. French beans do really well in this country. The only years when they don't particularly seem to thrive is when there's a lot of rain, because they seem to be quite susceptible to moulds.